How do I tune Tanium for virtual infrastructure like VMs and VDI? Well, welcome back to Tanium Tech Talks. I'm your host, Ashley McGlone. And, many folks who've worked in IT ops are familiar with the struggle of keeping virtual infrastructure properly resourced with memory, disk, CPU, network. And sometimes it's a balancing act of, the hardware we have, the budget we have to work with on what capabilities we can purchase, how many virtual machines we can host, right? And now in that environment that you've built, you're going to be deploying a real-time agent on every guest on those virtual hosts. So how can we make this the best experience possible? That's something that doesn't create a resource storm, right? Because there's so much value for putting Tanium even in your virtual environment. So this is the next installment of our Tanium Agent FAQ series. And back with me today is Jeff Stokes, who is uniquely qualified to address this subject. Well, hi, Jeff. Welcome back to the show. And tell us a little bit about your background in this area particularly.
Thanks for having me back. When I was at Microsoft, I did a lot of diagnosing and troubleshooting of VDI environments. Worked with the product group to even come up with the right way to sort of tune an image for VDI while at Microsoft. And now here, I interact with customers on a daily basis, pretty much, where they've got VDI or virtual infrastructure and rolling things out in a default manner. They can find themselves having some resource constraints, as you mentioned.
So it sounds like this is a wheelhouse that you've spent a lot of time in, and you've seen some different issues over the years, I'm sure. Could you tell us a little bit about, and not exactly that it's an issue for Tanium, right, necessarily. It's more of a configuration or tuning issue is really what we're talking about. Tanium works really well in these environments, but what are some of the issues that you've seen when people haven't configured Tanium properly?
If it's not tuned and configured properly, the assumption is that the endpoint is a physical device with all of its resources that are advertised to it. In a virtual environment, you'll see where the resources can become constrained, particularly, for example, you ask a question, hey, is this file on the disk? And you ask it of all endpoints. That's going to happen. We do things very quickly. Speed and scale is kind of our motto, or has been. If you go into a virtual infrastructure and ask for something quickly, we're going to respond as quick as we can. And depending on how your configuration is for your virtual infrastructure, you may not be able to handle everyone on every guest in the hosts all asking for something at the same time. So that's where configuration and tuning come into play.
What kinds of resource storms have you seen?
Disk latency or large number of IOPS. We've seen CPU go high in some instances, where customers on, a hardware-based solution for virtual infrastructure. We've certainly seen, the communication even between the different hosts in the virtual infrastructure have trouble communicating because they get busy. So it kind of runs the gambit. Even network traffic can be an issue at times. It's just, it kind of depends on what the customer environment is doing to achieve their density goals for VDI. Just really the whole thing, the whole idea of virtual infrastructure is to save money by not having, a physical piece of hardware for every single instance of Windows or Linux or what have you need.
So I know over recent years, we've made some engineering improvements in the Tanium client itself to help with examples of situations like this. Could you speak to some of those improvements?
Yeah, I work pretty closely with the engineering teams here, and we watch the endpoint performance like a hawk for one, and we have for a number of years now. It's something we're very sensitive to is, if we're, causing pain in a customer environment, we want to understand what's going on so we can remediate it for everybody if other people see it too. We've made optimizations to how we talk to the local databases. We've made optimizations to how often we touch the CPU. We've put in throttles in our client extensions that will make sure that the individual processes for Tanium don't go above a certain threshold. Reduce the IOPS load. I think I already said that. But yeah, we're pretty aggressive about it. We're even looking at memory footprint. How can we conserve memory? on the endpoint.
As much as I would like to get in the weeds of the ones and zeros, I'm going to take your engineering word for it. I know we've done a lot of improvements there, and we've seen not only the speed enhancements recently and the client updates, server updates, and so forth. So there have been a lot of improvements that have gone to help all endpoints, and particularly virtualized ones. So where I want to go next is talking about maybe some of the out of the box education items. I think if I'm a new Tanium customer, what do I need to know about how do I accommodate for those things? But first, I would say you're going to need a computer group or set of computer groups to target these machines. So for those of you who are watching, think of a criteria that you could use to select. Now, there's an all virtual computers kind of built in computer group, but maybe for you, it's based on a subnet range for your virtual infrastructure or a MAC address. Maybe all your virtualized MACs start with the same first half of the characters, right? Something like that. Find some criteria that you can use to target your virtualized endpoints. And then we're going to get into now some of these ways that you can adjust the Tanium platform. We've got some docs links for you below as well to cover some of these. And the disclaimer we have to make as we get into this, as Jeff begins to talk, is that each one of these is going to diminish that real-time performance you bought from Tanium. We're trying to slow it down a little bit so that it doesn't tax your virtual infrastructure. So just be aware that there is a slower data response in some of these cases. You're still going to get the data though. And so that's the value here. So Jeff, I've kind of given a number of disclaimers there. What would you say as we kind of get into this arena of some of the default platform capabilities?
I think that setting up things where, if it's clearly a VDI or shared virtual infrastructure, creating a computer group to rope those in, like you said, either by MAC address or subnet range or what have you. Taking that and then setting some of our distribute over time throttles in just to slow the client down, like you said, will certainly work wonders. There's also some additional considerations. We talk about things like index, threat response, comply. So there's some module specific guidance as well. We have the tuning that you can do just out of the box of the platform. Distribute over time with a virtual group certainly makes a lot of sense.
You may be watching this video and have never used Tanium before. I think probably first base is we have a sensor called is virtual. You can just tag on that extra sensor is virtual and see where the results are coming from. So that's a great way to start. So let's talk about like basic Tanium platform actions. Show us how we can optimize just something as simple as, like, for example, setting a registry key value across. This is a common use case, right? I've got 10,000 machines that all need to set a Windows registry value. How can I do that respectful to virtual infrastructure?
By and large, it's a pretty small, action, but certainly in a virtual environment, you do get computer name from all machines. Go ahead and get that. And then what we'll do is we'll target one of them and do a deploy action just as an example. And in here, we would put in create a key, for example, and give it architecture and set it and whatnot. But down here is where the important part is of the message, where obviously in an environment, if the machine's off, it's not going to get the settings. You want to do a recurring deployment in most cases. And then here we just do the distribute over time. And so by default, it's going to go and say, hey, everybody, go do this, go do this action. So if we do a distribute over time and even give it just a few minutes, let's say 5 minutes, what that's going to do is then randomize it based on a 5 minute before or after distribute over time, right? Or a 5 minute window. So that'll let the action get to the endpoints and actually get executed at a unique time, more or less, right? So it's not all at once.
Yeah, I was just going to say with the reissue every as well. So, common use case here for I'm trying to get a Windows registry setting out across the environment. Not everybody's online. Maybe I do it every 4 hours, but for virtual infrastructure, for some things, depending on the nature of it, maybe I do it every 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever. But then distribute over 5 minutes should take care of most of that.
Yeah, and if it's a more impactful action, maybe you want to increase the distribute over time for the virtual infrastructure hosted machines, or a lot of this depends on the idiosyncrasies of how the environment is set up, right? I mean, everyone's got their own way of building things for the most part, and you see some standardization, but yeah, depending on what the density is like, really is where it comes into play of how much do we need to distribute, and it's not like a hard fast rule. It's more of a see how this works, at scale, and getting a feeling for how Tanium works in your environment when it's all virtual or mostly virtual.
This is a really good segue then into some of the built-in safeguards. The reason I wanted us to record these videos is I saw some folks in some public forums complaining that, hey, wait, I did Tanium and it destroyed my virtual infrastructure. It's like, well, I think there's a training issue there because there's several protections built in out of the box based on your years of experience supporting virtual infrastructure and particularly Tanium in that environment. Where would you recommend for a new Tanium user to begin?
Creating a virtual group and setting the VDI settings on that, I think is probably the biggest bang for the buck. So it's going to be in our shared services, and then client management. And then in client management, you just go to the settings configuration area and create a settings configuration for your environment. So you can come in here and say, hey, this is for virtual machines. And then we're going to come down, do the enabled VDI settings, and then set these. And our documentations page has the good best practices for these. It's also here at the informationals. So random sensor delay, spread that out by about 20 seconds. Max age multiplier. So setting that to a value of 2 certainly helps out quite a bit with just how long or how often the endpoint is actually asking things that maybe haven't changed or they're asked frequently. And then the minimum distribute over time, we like to set this at about 60. That's going to just give you the minimum amount of time that when we send something out, when is it going to be received? And then you go to the safe client state interval. 1800 is a good practice for this one.
I know we went through those really fast.
Yeah.
Let's walk through
I'm
those.
sorry.
No, you're fine because I just know for you and I, we've done this a lot. There's some people who've seen this for the first time. So random sensor delay. So think about when you're asking a question and that sensor hits 10,000 endpoints all at the same time, then they're all going to query for that value. So random sensor delay is going to soften the blow on virtual machines, so they kind of distribute. It's like a distribute over for sensors.
Yes.
And then the max age multiplier, right? So
Yep.
normally sensors have like a 15-second life cycle, something like, or 15 minutes, sorry, 15-minute life cycle. And so this will multiply by 2, which means if I've just asked, what is the disk space free on my C drive in the last 30 minutes instead of 15, I'm not going to have to requery for that just to save some load on the endpoint.
Right.
Minimum distribute over time. What you just showed us here is the fact that now no matter what I put in the distribute over time, it's going to make sure it's no less than this value.
Right.
And the one that was always a mystery to me was the save client state interval, as long as I've worked here. But really all it means is the client's going to cache its state to disk. We're just going to do that less frequently. So that's helpful. I also want to scroll back up to the computer groups here. Select your computer group. This is where you're going to pick your virtual, if you just type virt there. Yeah. This is where we'll make sure all virtual machines, right? All Windows servers, Windows workstations, you can tune that way. So you're going to apply these settings then to all those machines. And then, so Jeff, now that we've got these settings, do they go to the endpoints automatically? How do I make sure that they're going to recognize this new configuration?
To actually push the settings out to the endpoints, you need to go here and do a deploy. And that'll send out the settings to all the endpoints, and then you'll have a much smoother experience on your virtual infrastructure as a result.
And that's great because what I like about those settings we just looked at is that's going to work for anything that I initiate as a user, but also anything the modules initiate, as the modules are all day long taking action and collecting information. So it's going to soften that impact across the entire environment.
That's right. And some people may ask, what's the impact of that? Is it going to mess up the console? No, it just, some things may respond a little bit slower. But again, you're slowing us down to not impact the entire environment at once.
we have some legendary modules that with some legendary capabilities. Could you talk about the index module for a second? Or that I guess now it's a shared service component under several modules. What does index do, and why do we need to manage its performance so closely?
And when you first enable it, we'll index the file system and all the local volumes and inventory what the contents are is the default behavior. With the image tuning for VDI or virtual environments, with regard to index, when you set up index, you can basically pre-index the image, and then when you seal the image, you've got what that volume is, what it contains is already indexed in the database. So then all your new VMs will be spun up and they'll already be pre-indexed. So they won't spin up and go, hey, I have to index the entire volume. I just need to catch up with what's changed since I was powered on last, which in that scenario should be basically nothing. So that's a real lightweight way of implementing index in a virtual environment is inventory first, then seal the image so the database is kept
I
with all the
like
file
that.
paths. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super handy because wow, you think about every time you spin up a new image, you're saving all that disk time. Very good.
Yeah, yeah, it can be a lot, I mean, if it's a complicated image, it could have a lot of files. So with index on VDI, if you're doing like a non-persistent pooled environment, it may not make sense to actually index those. I've seen customers where the life of a VM is measured in 1 or 2 or 3 days before it's reset, and at that point, it's just a fresh clone off the golden image. Does it make sense to index those and incur that disk cost? I don't know. It really depends on your security profile. That's certainly something you could think about, take a step back and say, what does it make sense to actually collect in these VDI environments that usually are pretty locked down security wise?
That's a good point because typically we think of virtual, I guess traditionally we think of a virtual server is going to be there for a while, for a year or two, whatever. But there's some,
Sure.
we call these ephemeral. They just spin up for a few hours, a few days. And so in the show notes below, there's some doc links on how to configure a gold image, whether that's for a virtual desktop or virtual server. And then also about tuning those ephemeral settings.
Yeah, it certainly it's something that the security team and operations probably need to have a conversation about. What are the needs, and then what does the hardware need to be able to provide to sustain what the needs are for the security profile you're keeping in the environment.
The module that's most famous for using, there are multiple modules that use this, is threat response, because threat response has the index and it uses the recorder as well under the hood. And so when it comes to specific modules within Tanium, there are some profile settings that you can optimize for how aggressive index is. When I say that, it makes me cringe for a second. It's not that it's aggressive necessarily. Out of the box, these things are tuned down, but you can tune them down even further for virtual infrastructure.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
On threat response, we just talked about those profiles, right? When you create a new scan profile for a group of workstations, there are a number of settings in there.
Beyond that, certainly if you have comply, we've had customers that want to run a single core, VM with a couple gig of RAM, and that's a prime candidate for like a low resource mode comply scan, where basically the scan would have to compete with the operating system for CPU time. The virtualized settings are certainly the biggest bang for the buck. The building a profile for all your virtual estate. I mean, I think on the box, Windows Server and Workstation still says it'll run on one core. It might even have been upgraded to two at this point. I don't know, but it used to be one core. Remember, that's the bare minimum, and bare minimum doesn't necessarily mean performant or responsive or usable even. So yeah, if you're doing density that aggressively, you're having single core machines, then it may be time to rethink how the density is gone too far on configuring density in your environment and not had enough usability, perhaps.
So, Jeff, thank you for this tour of these built-in platform optimizations for virtual infrastructure. And I know it feels like we just scratched the surface on this topic. I'm sure you've got years of stories to tell. But really, it really comes down to these few main things because we've talked about all the different ways that we can optimize the Tanium experience, whether that's baseline performance, setting your exclusions, looking at, here in this case, virtual infrastructure. Thank you for sharing your years of experience with us here. And for those of you who are watching on this particular topic, in the show notes below, you'll find some articles on virtualized client settings, your gold image client settings for those ephemeral short-lived VMs, some of the comply optimization options and threat response optimization options. So look for those in the show notes below. So thank you for joining us now for this Tanium FAQ series on the Tanium agent. And with these new settings in your bag of tricks, you'll notice that your end user performance, your server performance is going to be much better while you're still able to get all that trusted Tanium data for the certainty that you need to operate your environment every day. So thanks for joining us for this series. And if you haven't watched those other episodes, go back and check them out. They're right here on the playlist. And until next time, Go-Tanium.